For those of you that have been living under a rock, there's been a new story taking over the internet about a whistleblower complaint alleging that our government has not only recovered alien bodies and spacecraft, but has been reverse engineering their technology and has been lying about it to the American people for several decades. And a lot of responses to this story are along the usual lines, people getting drawn into the usual camps. The skeptics are saying it's all fake, and the hardcore believers are saying, yeah, I knew it the whole time. I've now heard several interpretations of this story, from these people are all clearly lying to maybe the aliens are angels as described in the book of Revelations. Yeah, no kidding. But this story is a little bit different for reasons we're going to get into in this video. But first, let's take a quick look at who this whistleblower is, the details of the story, and some important things to keep in mind if you're trying to approach this story with an open and yet justifiably skeptical mind. According to journalists Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal in an article published in The Debrief, whistleblower David Grusch is a highly decorated former combat officer in Afghanistan and veteran of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office. He was also the Reconnaissance Office's representative to the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force from 2019 to 2021. And from 2021 to 2022, he was the NGA's co-lead for UAP analysis and its representative to the task force. And UAP is that name that they came up with to try and navigate around all the stigma surrounding the name UFO. I guess the government decided that it makes it sound a little less crazy. And that UAP task force I just mentioned was reorganized into what they are now calling the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO. Now, this guy's credentials have apparently been run up and down the chain, and by all accounts, he seems to be a straight shooter. Several people have confirmed with journalists off the record, but what's unusual here is that there are others going on the record as well. Carl E. Nell, a recently retired Army colonel who was on the UAP task force with Grusch, characterized him as beyond reproach. Now, the reason these credentials are so important and why I wanted to talk about them first before I get into the details of his story is that it's not quite the usual suspect, is it? I mean, I think we've all seen so many ridiculous stories on the news that it gets pretty easy to conclude that someone even mentioning that they saw something weird means they're either lying or crazy.
To me, it look like a leprechaun to me. All I gotta do is look up in the tree. Who else seen the leprechaun say yeah? Yeah!
This amateur sketch resembles what many of you say the leprechaun looks like.
Alright, so now that we know who this whistleblower is, let's get into why we're all here. What is he actually saying? And from what I can tell, he's essentially making 4 key claims that are worth focusing on. The first is that the US government is in possession of recovered alien vessels and alien bodies.
Do we have bodies? Do we have species of
Well, naturally, when you recover something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds, it's true.
Now, this is obviously the most sensational part of the story and the one that's captured the most attention in headlines. It looks like at this recording that the longer version of Grusch's interview with Ross Coulthart was taken off of YouTube for some reason, but in that extended format, even Grusch expressed some hesitation about stating whether or not these were aliens from another planet. He says he has a physics degree. He took the time to theorize about whether or not these may be beings capable of interdimensional travel, rather than relying on what we would think of as movement through space. But either way, if this first claim is true, then it changes everything we know about the universe, and we finally get the answer to the question that humanity has been asking since we first gazed up at the stars thousands of years ago. Are we alone? The second claim is that our military and intelligence agencies have been lying to Congress and the public for decades.
If you're right, if you're telling us the truth, everyone, the entire American public, has been lied to for decades.
Yeah, there's a sophisticated disinformation campaign targeting the US populace, which is extremely unethical and immoral.
Anybody with even a casual knowledge of the history of the US intelligence agencies will find this easily the most credible of Grusch's claims. From the CIA's experiments with mind control and brainwashing using LSD and psychological torture on our own people, in programs like MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax, to its involvement destabilizing nearly every government in Central and South America, to the mass surveillance programs leaked by Edward Snowden, to say that the covert branches of the US government are less than scrupulous would be the understatement of the century. And those are just the programs that we know about. If you take the alien element out of it, there shouldn't be a single person in the country who has trouble believing that our government would lie to us. The third claim is that multiple governments around the world have programs similar to our own. Perhaps with good reason, the US government has kind of become the boogeyman for covert operations around the globe. We have the most resources at our disposal, so if any government is likely to be involved in this kind of activity, it's probably going to be ours. But if we are capable of it, why wouldn't other adversarial governments like China and Russia? The stealing of intellectual trademarks and military technology by China is well documented, so it's not like the US is the only country in the world capable of engaging in covert operations. The French government has already released 30 years of files to the public on their UAP program, so we already have some degree of confirmation that these programs exist in other countries. Again, this one's not that hard to believe. And then lastly, and what I believe could be the most important part of this story that no one really seems to be focusing on very much, is that Grusch's claims in the whistleblower complaint is that he was retaliated against when they found out that he confidentially spoke to the Inspector General about his concerns. One of the most common arguments that you hear from skeptics about UFO stories is if there are so many people that know about this stuff, then why don't we have any proof? Why aren't more people coming forward? And if you understand human nature, it really isn't all that hard to imagine when you think about it. Imagine you work at a Foot Locker and your boss is stealing shoes. But you're a single mom and you don't want your boss to come after you because this shitty job is the only thing putting food on the table. Yeah, your boss probably deserves to get fired, but the headache just isn't worth it. Now imagine you're in someone like David Grusch's shoes and your boss is the most powerful military and intelligence apparatus in the world. They have every tool at their disposal to ruin your life and expose every dirty secret you have and leak it to the press. Or, if they're really worried, just have you smoked on your way to get a bagel for breakfast. Not only that, but the information environment is so tightly controlled that getting any definitive proof out to the public is extraordinarily difficult. Even if you had seen the spaceship and touched the alien body with your own hands, are you going to come forward with no proof under those conditions? Okay, so we've heard one side of the story, and now let's be honest with ourselves here. Skeptics are pushing back hard on this story, and even though they have the work cut out for them, to be fair, there are a lot of people in the UFO community that are just batshit nuts. And that has made wading through the nonsense spewed by crazy people or pathological liars and getting to any nugget of verifiable proof virtually impossible. The air of mystery and conspiracy around UFOs has always attracted the kinds of people that want to see aliens around every corner and will take everything at face value. My position on extraterrestrial life is that it is a virtual mathematical certainty that they exist. In all the vastness of the universe, with billions of stars and planets revolving around most of them, the chances that we are the only life in the universe is honestly a scarier thought than aliens coming to visit. But I've always held that there's a significant limitation with this theory, and that is the technological ability to travel potentially millions of light years across the galaxy in the span of one organic lifespan. This is why the claim of finding bodies for me is probably the hardest to believe. Given our own advances into artificial intelligence, I find it far more likely that if we did encounter alien spacecraft, they would be piloted by some form of non-organic AI rather than an actual live alien. But if we're going to stay logical here, humans in our short time on this Earth have already sent probes, satellites, and live humans into space. Imagine if we had a few more thousand years to figure it out. Those technological gaps start getting a lot easier to fill in. All that being said, there are some things that I myself am skeptical about with this story. Since Grusch doesn't have first-hand knowledge, so far the only information that's been released to the public are vague details of second-hand accounts. Obviously that makes it a lot harder to make definitive statements. And this is just a personal issue I have after watching some of Grusch's interviews so far, but he almost seems to be a little too comfortable with providing some of those dramatic flares to his storytelling. That could mean a lot, could mean absolutely nothing. People get weird when they're on camera, just my personal take on it. Additionally, some of the parts of his testimony aren't really all that surprising if you understand how the compartmentalization of the government works. One of his claims is that he wasn't read into other programs that he believes are the ones responsible for collecting these spacecraft. And on that point, if your clearance doesn't give you access to those programs, then you wouldn't be read into them. The government, especially military and intelligence communities, they don't just allow someone with the clearance that Dave Grusch had the ability to just demand access to all kinds of different programs. So that part doesn't strike me as necessarily compelling. I only see 3 possible scenarios here that could explain the story adequately. And while each scenario has its problems and gaps, if true, each would explain what's going on. The first is that Grusch and other whistleblowers are either all crazy, mistaken, or deliberately misleading the public. There's a possibility that these insiders believe they were in fact part of these programs, but didn't have the full picture or the security clearance to really understand what they were involved in. That seems unlikely since these individuals would have great personal and professional risk to themselves for even coming out with this story in the first place.
Because everybody watching this right now is looking at your face. they're going, is this guy for real?
I am for real. And I'm sitting here at great personal risk and obvious professional risk by talking to you today.
It's basically a guarantee that your employment with the federal government is over. So I don't really think any sane person would jeopardize their entire career on an office rumor. Not only that, but they would have passed the most stringent background and security checks to even get that kind of clearance in the first place. Along with that, I'm sure it was a very careful psychological analysis by Grusch's superiors and others. So it seems doubtful that these people would all of a sudden have a mental break all at the same time. Although this option would explain what's going on, it's the least likely scenario in my opinion. The second option is that this is a coordinated campaign by the Pentagon to slowly drip out information about programs that actually do exist. Grusch and the others on the inside that have confirmed his story are very much in on these programs and are releasing it this way on purpose to ease the American public into the truth. It's possible, but I think this option gets a little shaky as well. Namely because of the retaliation claim that I spoke about a little earlier. Retaliation claims get kind of hard to prove without, well, proof. And it seems likely that he turned over proof of retaliation to the Inspector General for him to have found the complaint credible. So either this is a really elaborate ruse, or there's the third option, and this is perhaps the scariest option. And that is, he's telling the truth. Grusch's story is 100% true, and he has indeed spoken to people with first-hand knowledge of these programs. And he believes that those elements of the government responsible for aircraft recovery and reverse engineering programs have been lying to the public for nearly 100 years, that they continue to lie about it, and we deserve to know the truth. In all three scenarios, we can draw a common conclusion. Someone in the government is lying to the American people. Either Grusch and these other anonymous whistleblowers speaking to journalists are lying, crazy, or mistaken, or the intelligence and military groups in our government are lying to us. This is no longer a case of some Jim Bob in the desert seeing bright lights that can be easily discredited. It's pretty easy to make the case that Jim Bob could have seen weather balloons, light reflected through a pocket of gas, or he's just a local crazy. He doesn't have access to classified documents or video recordings that would corroborate his story. But that's not the case this time. These are now several people with the security clearance and access to these programs on the inside coming out and saying that these programs exist. And again, because I'm just trying to approach this logically, regardless of what skeptics are saying, there is an abundance of video recordings that the military and intelligence agencies are slowly dripping out that even they are now saying they can't explain. And even if you want to discredit 99.9% of people's eyewitness testimony to having seen or encountered these things, there are so many instances of these events that you have to start to question if even 0.1% of these stories are true. That's still hundreds, perhaps thousands of instances of eyewitness testimony that can't be explained. That doesn't necessarily mean that we should invent fanciful stories that attempt to fill in all the gaps that we don't have answers to, but you have to ask yourself, if this story is true, are we really being visited by extraterrestrial beings and our governments know about it?
And they're not human. They're 100% they're not human.